Welcome to Not This, Not That, where we push our boundaries of understanding and perception. I am your host, Rev Patricia Cagganello, and I invite you to join me as we open to the possibility that things may not be exactly as you believe, as you've been told, that there could be more, that in our collective consciousness is the potential for the all. Today we are speaking with American mystic, mysteries expert, and best-selling author of 4 books, Tricia McCannon, on Jesus as a master initiate of the ancient mystery schools. We are going to expand the conversation about where Jesus really was during the first 30 years of his life and the ancient mystery schools which he studied. So welcome, Tricia McCannon, to Not This, Not That.
Oh, thank you so much, Patricia, for having me. It's a pleasure to be with all of our listeners today, especially on such a great show with Sacred You and Sacred Media.
Thank you. I'm excited that you're here. And I'm excited that one of the first conversations for Not This, Not That is really pushing our boundaries of understanding and perception on the great master Jesus. Because I really believe that Jesus' story has not been fully told, that there is so much more to him that needs to be said.
You are so right. In fact, this is one of the things I think I've been most excited about is bringing his hidden teachings to light, as well as, of course, where he studied during those 30 misting years and how there were over 5 different chapters of the great spiritual mystery schools that knew that he was coming, that his birth had been prophesied for over 500 years by the Druids, by the Egyptians, by the Persians, by the Buddhists, and of course by the Essenes themselves in the area around Galilee and Jerusalem. So, this is one of the reasons why I wrote my book, Jesus, the Explosive Story of the 30 Lost Years in the Ancient Mystery Religions, and then I followed it with a book called Return of the Divine Sophia that has a lot of his secret teachings in it. And this course that I've just finished has got over 2,000 absolutely jaw-dropping, gorgeous images that really fully illustrate this journey that he took from the time he was born. When was he really born? What was that darn Star of Bethlehem? Which actually probably it was a blessed Star of Bethlehem. I love the Star of Bethlehem story. Who were those magi? Where did they come from? And what countries were they connected with? So, that's just the beginning of the story. And then there's all those years where he was studying with the Essenes. And the Essenes, of course, are one of the great chapters of the mystery schools that were hidden in the areas around Qumran. They had 9 different centers. They also had a school in Mount Carmel, and that's where Jesus and John the Baptist studied.
So what's so fascinating is that Jesus did study, and your book is research. First of all, let's just say Jesus, the Explosive Story of the 30 Lost Years in the Ancient Mystery Religions, has over 100 pages of footnotes and documentation. So what we're talking about and what you have brought to life in the Sacred You course that you created, The Lost Years of Jesus and Secret Schools of Initiation, you've brought your 2 books to life. You brought to life the story of Jesus, but from a perspective of being fully researched, fully documented. So it's the real story. It is not just something that would be a great story if it was true.
You're absolutely right. And I think that there's so many different aspects of it that, this book took me 3 years to write. And I have collected books my whole life on these hidden documents around Jesus, books from the Vatican, books from ancient Britain, where Joseph of Arimathea in 37 AD set up the very first Christian community in the world, books from India, where explorers like Nicholas Natovich, Nicholas Roerich, and at least a half a dozen others actually went over to India to these monasteries and found these sacred documents that chronicle the life of Jesus at the time that he was alive, when he was in India, when he was living with the Buddhists. They brought a lot of these manuscripts back. Some of them actually, most of them, are actually in the Vatican. Nicholas Natovich tells us And he, of course, was a political writer from the late 1800s. He actually went over and found these manuscripts and published some of them in a slender book called The Unknown Life of Jesus Christ. And that was around 1888. And of course, it sold out immediately. It was a bestseller all over Europe and so forth. But he found out that the Vatican, I think, has over like 119 hidden manuscripts that have been brought by missionaries and people who love Jesus that discovered these accounts. They brought them back to the Vatican, and they were all hidden. They were all suppressed. And it's, of course, a shame because, just the fact that he studied with all of these ancient traditions, if anything, it improves his our perception of his depth and breadth, his knowledge, his commitment to wisdom, to world transformation. Much as we hear Pythagoras. Pythagoras was around 500 BC. Pythagoras was Greek. He studied 22 years in the temples of ancient Egypt. He studied in the Greek mystery schools. He studied in the Druid mystery schools, and he even went to Chaldea and Babylon and to Persia. And so he was 500 years before Jesus. And Pythagoras, of course, is where we get all of our mathematical theory today. Pythagorean theorems, the Euclidean geometry, things like that. So in Jesus's time, all those great mystery schools would have only have given him more prestige and more status. But of course, what happens over time is that, when the church formed, it initially formed from those beautiful apostles that were doing their best to try to understand Jesus's wisdom. Joseph of Arimathea in England, that was probably a pretty untainted group. And then a lot of the major apostles, as you know, were assigned to different countries, like Thomas went to India, and Mark, I think, went down to Egypt. And so we wind up having over the next 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, as the Christian movement grew, we have a lot of oppression with the Roman Empire. If we remember Caligula and Nero, they were pretty rough on those early Christians and threw a lot of them into the arena, the Colosseum, to see them torn apart by lions. And so then you have Constantine, who is the early 300s, who actually had sanctuaries and temples to all the gods, all the goddesses, all the different ways in which the divine has been worshipped or understood, at least in his time, Greek and Roman and Egyptian and so forth. And so what happened was he eventually, of course, decided to embrace Christianity. And so he legitimized Christianity, so Christians couldn't be killed anymore, except sometimes by other, angry Christians or Jews or whatever. But in the Roman Empire, he stopped that, thank goodness. And we had the early development of codifying Christian literature. And, we got the Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Synoptic Gospels and so forth. But there are over 50 other Gospels that have been discovered with an Nag Hammadi text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And because of this, we now know that there's an enormous body of knowledge from the Gnostics on about the teachings of Mary Magdalene, about the teachings of Jesus. In fact, the Gnostics, which were the early Christians, and probably closest to what Jesus was actually really teaching, the Gnostics recorded over 250 of Mary Magdalene's sayings. And I'm hoping, with Sacred you and I have talked about this in February, March of next year, 2018, we may launch a class on Mary Magdalene or the Sacred Feminine, because it's so important at this time. But her story is, of course, deeply linked to the story of Isa or Yeshua or Jesus as we know him. So we, of course, wanted to really start with him because he's so pivotal to our worldview, and his teachings of unconditional love and forgiveness and the kingdom of heaven is within, and treat your brother as you would want to be treated. If we all lived according to the wisdom of his teachings and his example, we would have a wonderful world. It would be a different place altogether. And this, of course, is why I'm so passionate about this amazing class with Sacred You, is because we're actually filling in the gaps of where was he Who knew he was coming? What did he learn? Where did they study? How is it reflected in his current teachings? And what are the lost teachings that are so important for us to bring back in this time? So, you can see I'm excited about the course.
So we're speaking with Tricia McCannon, Mysteries Expert, about Jesus as a master initiate of the ancient mystery schools. So that's what we're saying on Not This, Not That. And Tricia, as she has mentioned, has put together a phenomenal course for Sacred You called The Lost Years of Jesus and Secret Schools of Initiation, where she shares over 9 hours of video teaching. She leads you through almost 2,000 images explaining Jesus and all of the mystery schools he studied at and what he learned. And today we're going to take a short trip through those mystery schools, and Tricia will share which ones Jesus visited and some basic information or important information on why he needed to go to that mystery school. So Tricia, let's start with the Essenes. The Essenes were a spiritual community that Jesus studied with in his early years.
Yes, there are 7 modules in this class. The very first module, which people can watch for free, is about presenting the existence of the mystery school that were really all pervasive in the world at that time, but today, have been forced to go underground. Module 2 is about the Star of Bethlehem, the Magi, when was he really born, and what does it mean astrologically? And we take a look at 4 key dates, and certainly one of them or 2 of them were December 25th, believe it or not, but there's an amazing date in October, which would have made him a Libra, and then there's a date in the end of July where the Magi, there's a lot of documentation about the Magi knowing that there was important conjunction between Sirius and Regulus that signaled the birth of the new king, the new Horus king, and that would have probably made him a Leo. And so I talk about all of those things in the second module. In the third module, we get into the wisdom of the Essenes, where I talk about where they met, where their sinners were, their 9 sinners. These were secret sinners. We know about Qumran, and some people know that there was a school at Mount Carmel, which in that mountain, this is where Elijah in the Old Testament had once lived in a cave, and it had always been a sacred mountain. So John the Baptist, which was Jesus' cousin 6 months earlier, he would have studied there. But we talk about what they taught, how they taught basically angelology, how they taught about connecting with the powers of healing. The first level of the Essenes were the healers. The second were the historians or the scientists or the teachers. And the third were, of course, the great masters. And we talk about some of them were married and had families, and some of them were celibate, and they were scholars. We talk about a lot of things about the Essenes that are really important for us to understand and know, because for a long time, we just kind of dismissed them because the Sadducees and the Pharisees were the dominant money and political powers in Jerusalem. And the Essenes had subtracted themselves from a lot of that politics, but they were really the ones holding the light in that area of the world. And then in module 4 and 5, we go into the Celtic lands. The 4, as you know, is really all about the Druids. Who the heck were those wily Druids anyway? And of course, they had an incredible tree culture. They had an alphabet called Ogham that was actually all about the trees. They were some of the most powerful healers on the planet because they understood how to work with plants and herbs, which of course down in Jerusalem, there was a lot of desert sand. So I'm sure they were good healers too, but at a different level. The Druids, most people don't know, had over 60 universities and 60,000 students. And the families of the rich and powerful elite throughout the Mediterranean, they either sent their kids to study in the Celtic lands by the Druids, the Greek philosophers, or to Egypt. Those were the places that the rich and powerful children were sent to study. And a full course of study in the Druid schools was 20 years. That's incredible. So that whole 4th section is all about the Druids and Joseph of Arimathea and Jesus' links through his grandmother Anna, who had been a princess in the Celtic lands. And we really talk about the evidence that they came there, when he came there, the different trips that he made, how he got there, and so forth. In section 5, we get into the secrets of the Holy Grail, one of my favorite subjects.
Before we get into the Holy Grail, though, I think it's a really important point to make when you were mentioning the rich and powerful sending their children to the ancient mystery schools. Jesus was not the poor shepherd boy. Mary was not the poor shepherd girl. Can you speak to that just for a moment?
Well, what I would say is, of course, they certainly seem to be modest in terms of their income, but Mary and Joseph, the father and mother, were both highly trained initiates. Mary not only had training from the Essenes, but more than likely also with the Egyptian mystery schools. And we certainly know that Mary Magdalene did a full course of study with the priestesses of Isis in ancient Egypt. Joseph of Arimathea, of course, was Mary's older brother, which would have been Jesus's uncle. He was also an Essene, but some people think he was a Sanhedrin publicly because he was so wealthy and prosperous, and he had, 5 ships that were coming and going. He was a tinsmith. He had a whole crew working for him up in Britain, and he actually was given the honors of being a Roman decurion, which is almost like a provincial governor, except they needed him in the Celtic lands because tin is a very important ingredient to make bronze weapons. And so the Roman Empire considered that to be of the utmost importance in order for them to sort of remain, the first power nation. So Mary and Joseph, Joseph the father, the carpenter, he was a highly respected man, an older man, Now older could have been, 40 if she was 15 years old. So, that could have definitely been older, and maybe they only lived to be about 60 or 65 back then, because lifespan seems like, life is a little harsher than it is for most of us in the modern society. So he was very prosperous, and they went on to have 7 children. Even though a lot of this is as suppressed as possible within the church, we still find it in the writings that Jesus was the oldest, the firstborn, but then there were other sisters and brothers, and there are references in the text about how Jesus had, his mother showed up with his siblings, with his brothers and sisters, and so forth. So, it's a very different story, but then what it's been simplified down, sort of like Jesus for dummies, so to speak, in the church. And of course, it doesn't change the essential wisdom or message at all, except it expands it to a much more profound level. The things we hear that he spoke about in the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, absolutely. A lot of those gospels tell the same basic story, and there's lots of wisdom and beauty in those. But what if you could suddenly find out about a whole bunch of other really amazing things that he taught his apostles in secret? What if you could actually find out what the inner teachings were that bring us to spiritual awareness and enlightenment, and take a look behind the curtain at the great mystery schools where we learned this wisdom?
So let's continue through the mystery schools. So now you were about to speak about the Holy Grail in Britain.
Well, the Holy Grail is just such an incredibly deep subject, and it's one that I think has continued to resonate for all of us for over 2,000 years. Most of us, of course, associate it with King Arthur, and I hope that when we do our next podcast, which I think you asked me if I would do one on the amazing study of hermetics, I'm hoping maybe we'll be able to talk at more length about that one. Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Well, definitely. I will just say the Holy Grail, is everything from King Arthur to a symbol for the path of mastery. So I'm sure we'll revisit that in our next podcast. Yes.
But staying with just the Holy Grail, and let's just connect Britain a little bit more, because it was a very important place. I mean, Jesus visited with the Druids, but then let's just mention, because we brought it up, that is where Joseph of Arimathea went after the crucifixion. So just kind of tie in Avalon, Glastonbury, the Holy Grail, just into the story
Well, of
today.
course, in this course with Sacred You, I absolutely go there, where we're taking a look at the 7 islands that were in the inland coast. That today, now for about 17 miles, is gorgeous farmland with these hills. At the time, they were it was water, it was ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, and these hills came out like a great dragon. And Avalon was a chief initiation center for the Druids in that area. And of course, when Joseph of Arimathea came and he asked for land, and of course he knew the Druids, they were friends of his and vice versa, but he had to negotiate for this land. So they gave him Avalon, they actually only because he planted this staff, I think it was a hawthorn staff, and it sprouted. And it was it was cut off at the bottom and the top like a normal staff, and it actually sprouted and formed roots and began to bloom. And the Druids took this as a very powerful sign that the Christians were meant to be there. And of course, this is about 37 AD, so just after the crucifixion. So Jesus would have, that crucifixion probably would have happened in either 36 or 37 AD, which kind of gives you an idea. If he was born around 6 or 7 BC, so add 37 to 6 plus 0, that tells you he was about 40, 45 or 46, something like that. So that's probably about how old Jesus actually really was. And I talk about this age too, because there was a lot that he did before he got around to doing his 3-year mission. And I think it's important to honor him for that. Such a profound being and such a profound commitment.
Absolutely. So we're expanding the conversation about who Jesus really was. Is Jesus as a master initiate of the ancient mystery schools? And we're speaking with mysteries expert Tricia McCannon, who has written 4 best-selling books and has brought to life 2 of those books in this a beautiful course for Sacred You called The Lost Years of Jesus and Secret Schools of Initiation, which is available through Sacred Stories Media and Sacred You. So, Tricia, now we're moving on to India. Let's speak about Jesus in India.
Yeah, and I hope you'll post a link to the class with this, because that way people can just go take a look at it, and they can actually take the first module for free. It's easy peasy to do, and it's fun. I just had someone text me and said, I saw the first module, it was fabulous, I want to take the class. So it's easy to do. There are 7 sections with this. So section 6 is about India, his time with India, with the Hindus, training in those schools, and then his time with the Buddhists in Rajagira. And you and I did a Facebook Live, I think a day or so ago, that was really about talking a little bit about the Buddha and the similarities between their teachings and their miracles and so forth. Again, in no way does this discount or dishonor Jesus. These are both profound avatars whose wisdom have changed the world for over 2,000 or 2,500 years. And then the 7th section, of course, is about the 7 years that Jesus spent in the mystery schools of ancient Egypt. And that is a very profound section in itself, because we begin to understand in that section a great deal about the great spiritual mysteries at a level, even though each one of these, let us say, chapters has revealed a body of wisdom or knowledge or information. Once we get to Egypt, it was kind of like the motherland of the mysteries. And we know, of course, of all the cultures in the world, that culture probably has continued, for 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years at least. And that's the modest traditional version of how long Egyptian history went on. And of course, if we look at some of the Sumerian records, they would have us believe that it really had gone on for thousands of years before that. And then, of course, the Great Flood took place, and then everyone had to rebuild. But Jesus was actually in the temples of Heliopolis, and he was in a number of different places studying. And of course, there was a branch of the Essenes down there as well called the Therapeutae. The Therapeutae were very, very similar to the Essenes. They did sun worship every morning when they got up, and they lived around Lake Mauritius. So there's a lot to say, and Of course, I love the Egyptian mysteries. And I think we begin to understand in that particular segment, the last segment or module of this course, how Jesus had already perfected all these other subtle energy bodies. You know, the astral body, the etheric body, the mental body, the causal body, the emotional body, the soul body, all of these different bodies. But there were two additional bodies that he actually had to learn to activate in order to fulfill the mission of dying and being able to regenerate his body and then materialize the body when he wanted to and dematerialize the body when he did not want to, or when he chose not to be material, or to actually appear in different physical forms. And when we begin to read some of these apocryphal texts, we discover that there's a time when he appeared to his apostles after the crucifixion, of course, as an older man. He appeared as a young boy. And then there's a story about his apostles traveling to a city called, I think it was called Essenes. And he actually appeared as a person that looked similar to Jesus, but not the same, about the same age. And of course, he began to teach them. And, you know, a few hours into it, it's like, is it you, Master? Is it you? And they're like, yeah, it's me. And so there was a level of mastery that we don't even understand today because we've lost the spiritual technology to be able to do it. But can you imagine the depth of commitment that Issa or Yeshua would have had to have, and we know about, you know, raising the dead and healing the sick and giving sight to the blind, but to be able to alchemicalize his body. And this is, of course, why that whole scene with Mary Magdalene, when he first, you know, appears to her in the garden after the crucifixion, where he says, don't touch me yet, you know, because he's saying, I'm not totally solid yet. You know, it's not safe. And then later, a day or two later, 3 days later, he appears to Thomas, and it's like, yeah, you want to touch the, you know, prints in the hands, you want to feel the wound in the side, you can touch me now. So, you know, you can see how, I mean, to me, you know, I had always thought Jesus was cool. But, you know, growing up in the Deep South, I felt like that I wasn't being told the whole story. I really just felt like that there was a whole lot more to the story than, you know, what meets the eye. And I could not make sense of how the Old Testament God of hellfire, brimstone, and damnation fit together with the God of unconditional love and forgiveness. And so, of course, the answer is really they're two different understandings of God from the human perspective. And the God that Jesus presented is, I think, to me, the God with the big G. And so I always loved his teachings, but I felt really limited a lot of times when I went to churches, and I felt like that the ministers were doing their very best. And of course, there's great good that's done in a lot of these churches for their participants, for the world relief efforts that they do. I mean, there's so many good people that are involved with them, but still I felt like there was something deeper. And so this is, of course, why at the end of the day, I've always had a passion for this subject, and why I took the time to do the work to bring the pieces together so that I could share it with other people, so that in our time we could allow these deeper messages of Jesus to begin to surface, so that we're not just having shallow Christianity, we're actually understanding at a deeper level who he was, what he was about, and what he came to teach. And what he came to teach wasn't preachy. It was really about Some of the things we don't know: honoring women, honoring the divine feminine and masculine in balance. That was key. Treating animals with kindness, the power of reincarnation, and how we go through these successive lifetimes until we eventually become masters. We become enlightened. And that's where we're all going. And he even said, you too will do as I do, and even greater. He goes on to say that he who actually manages to go through this spiritual transformation or technology that he taught in some of these hidden teachings actually will become a Christ like himself. And so he didn't come to be put on a pedestal. He came to set an example to say, if I can do it, all of us can do it. And I think at this time in the world, we need to begin to embrace this greater wisdom and to internalize it, and then to begin to live into it, not from a point of fundamentalism or everyone that doesn't believe like I do should be, killed in the holy jihad, but from a point of view of compassion and self-wisdom, self-enlightenment. And by changing our perspective and broadening it and deepening it, we go through an alchemical transformation in ourselves that leads us closer and closer to that mastery, not only for ourselves, but for the world.
We're speaking with American mystic and mysteries expert Tricia McCannon on who Jesus really was. Jesus as a master initiate in the mystery schools. And Tricia, I have to say, I agree with you completely. And I agree that in this expanded perception, right, when we really can see Jesus in a greater depth and breadth than what we've already been taught, I think we can appreciate him even more. We honor him even more, and I believe that it allows us to step into our own spiritual presence and power so much more because, and as you said, that is exactly what Jesus came to do, and what he would want is for us to do that.
In fact, that's exactly right. So I'm hoping you guys that are listening out there have enjoyed this. And if you want to know more about me, you can go to my website, which is www.TriciaMcCannon Speaks. It's just like it sounds, TriciaMcCannon Speaks.com. And I'm hoping maybe you'll post a link for them if they want to check out the course and watch the first module of the 7 for free. It's a great holiday gift to give to yourself and to give to others.
Absolutely. Thank you, Tricia McCannon, for joining us. We will be posting the link to the website for the Lost Years of Jesus and Secret Schools of Initiation, this beautiful online course over 9 hours of video teaching by Tricia McCannon, where she not only brings Jesus to life, but she brings the ancient mystery schools to life also. So thank you for being with us. You've been listening to Not This, Not That, and I've been your host, Rev Patricia Cagganello. Thank you so much.